But I do want to make sure that I get the names of all of our sponsors included because we're incredibly grateful and we've got some wonderful community partners tonight as well. So I'd like to start by extending a special thank you to our exhibition sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Texas Instruments, whose support enabled us, that's right, woo! Whose support enabled us to bring this exhibition to Dallas. We're incredibly grateful for Texas Instruments' ongoing incredible support. We're also grateful to our anchor sponsors, Bank of Texas, Debbie and Ron Green, and Match Group. And lastly, thank you to our partner sponsor, the Dallas Tourism Public Improvement District. We also have some really wonderful exhibition community partners tonight. Bear with me, this is a little bit longer list. Dallas After School, Friends of Juanita Craft, Civil Rights House and Museum, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, Preservation Dallas, Project Unity, Remembering Black Dallas, Southwest Jewish Congress, Vocal Alcove, and Youth Revive. What an incredible group of sponsors and community partners. Thanks so much for helping me thank them. We couldn't do this work without our sponsors and community partners. Also, as always, I am pleased to welcome our museum members, our volunteers, our generations, who are second and third generations of Holocaust survivors, and our board members. I am always grateful for your incredible support. And we have some special guests in the audience tonight as well. We're joined by Dorothy Cantor, who is leading the campaign to establish the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historic Park. Mark, hold your applause, I have two more. Mark Wittig, the artist who created the schoolhouse models in display in the exhibition, and Stephanie Deutsch, who authored You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South. And she is married to a great grandson of Julius Rosenwald. Would you three be able to stand up and wave so we can welcome you? Here we are. Thank you so much for your work and for being here with us tonight. We're so honored to host A Better Life for Their Children through August 17th. If you haven't yet seen the exhibition, it details one of the most transformative initiatives in American history, in which Jewish businessman and philanthropist Julius Rosenwald and Black educator Booker T. Washington worked together to build thousands of schools for Black children across the segregated South and Southwest. It's an incredible story of partnership, coalition building, and working to involve the communities that were affected, both the Black community members and the white community members, to address a critical need. Our country needs more of this right now, and so we're so thrilled to have this exhibition. If you haven't gone through the exhibition, you can tour it tonight until 9 p.m., or I invite you to come back. It's up through August 17th. Please spread the word and bring your friends. And now it's my honor to introduce Andrew Feiler. Andrew is a photographer, author, and curator of A Better Life for Their Children. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian, and The Atlantic, as well as on CBS This Morning, PBS, and NPR. His prints have been displayed in galleries and museums, including the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta and the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. His photographs are in public and private collections, including the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institution's National Portrait Gallery. What an honor it is to have him here. We actually were speaking earlier, and I want to have first dibs on his next exhibition, so you heard it here. One last thing I wanted to share before I forget. As we were preparing for tonight, one of our board members called us and said, you know, my mother was rescued from Nazi Germany by Mr. Rosenwald. And Dr. Sarah Abosh, our Chief Education Officer, immediately went to work to do the research, and Andrew corroborated this. It was Julius Rosenwald's son who used the funds that Julius Rosenwald had set up in the Rosenwald Fund to bring 300 of their family members from Nazi Germany. And so we owe thanks to the Rosenwald family for one of our board members. It's pretty wonderful. At the end of the talk, we'll have an opportunity for question and answer. As usual, our volunteers will come around and pick up those note cards, so please write your questions and hold them up, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. And now, it's my honor to welcome Andrew Feiler to the stage.
Thank you all for being here. What an exquisite staging of this exhibition. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great honor for this work to be here. And I'm so appreciative of all of the folks involved in bringing all of this extra local material to help bring this story into Texas, and also for the beautiful everything from the wall color to the staging to the recreation of the classroom has really been exquisitely done. I am going to start with two. First of all, can you turn the side lights down a little bit? And I'll let y'all do that. I am going to start with two premises. The first premise is that the Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically improves African-American educational opportunities, African-American educational outcomes. It helps establish the foundation of education and leadership that helps make the civil rights movement happen when it happens. And yet, this remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep is largely unknown. The second premise is that the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is one of the earliest collaborations between blacks and Jews in the cause that only later becomes known as civil rights. And there's a direct connection between the partnership, the collaboration, the friendship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, with his white beard flowing, marching arm in arm with Dr. King in the front lines of the movement, and who famously says that when he marched with Dr. King, it felt like his legs were praying. And what happened in Georgia on January 5th of 2021, where filmmaker John Ossoff and the Reverend Raphael Warnock, having crisscrossed the state of Georgia together for 8 weeks in a runoff, developing not just a political alliance, but a deep personal friendship. And Georgia sends its first Jewish American and its first African American to the United States Senate. This is not a political statement, this is an historical statement. The relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. I'm going to start with a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. Julius Rosenwald is born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home in Springfield. If you go to downtown Springfield today, there's a 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historic Site where they have preserved the historic buildings. And across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. Peter Ascoli, who's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that when he was researching the biography, he went down and he was meeting with the superintendent of this National Historic Site, and he said, "Do you happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was?" And the superintendent says, "You're sitting in it." Julius Rosenwald's childhood home is the offices of the superintendent. Now, there was not a plaque out in front of the building at that time. Today there is a plaque, and that plaque was placed there by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historic Site. As Mary Pat stole my thunder a little bit, I was going to ask Dorothy Cantor, the visionary behind this campaign, and Stephanie Deutsch, the author, and one of the board members of the campaign, to stand, but they've already stood, so we'll forego the second bow. But the idea behind this campaign is a visitor center in Chicago with Rosenwald schools in each of the 15 states. And legislation cleared Congress at the end of 2020, mandating that the Secretary of the Interior do what's known as a special resources study, a feasibility study of the idea of the national park. That report came out last summer. And when this happens, and eventually it will happen, this will be the first component of the U.S. National Park System to honor a Jewish American. Now, Julius Rosenwald rises to become president of Sears, Roebuck and Company, and with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he helps turn Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history, and his cause is what only later becomes known as civil rights. Booker T. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle in the president's home of what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. Now, this is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. At the rededication ceremony, former students, former teachers, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. As you'll see, the image on the cover of my book is a photograph of the restored classroom in this schoolhouse, and in the back left-hand corner, you can see this quilt hanging. Now, these two men met in 1911, and you have to remember 1911 is before the Great Migration. So 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so in 1912, these two men create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. This is a photograph of students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School in Jefferson County, Kentucky, generally known as Louisville. And I want to talk about the structure of the program because there is genius in the structure of the program that these two men create. They reach out to the black communities of the South and they say, if you will contribute to a school because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating black-white dialogue as a vector for future progress, and these have to be public schools. So that while we would welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, the school system has to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. If you do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now, I want to pause for a second and just talk about this image as a historical document. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on them. And Booker T. Washington has photographs made just like this of students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities. And he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved he's committing to expand the program. All of my bodies of photography prior to this body were in color, but it was in part the recognition of the role of black and white photography in this history that I chose to shoot this body of work in black and white, because these photographs continue to be made throughout the entire history of the program. They become part of the history of the program. They become the visual language of the program. So, as I said, the program starts in 1912 when the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama is the first to raise the matching fund for what will become the first Rosenwald School. 1912, to 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of what will be the last Rosenwald School, the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, Warm Springs. The program from 1912 to 1937 builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states, and the results are transformative. Now, I want to pause for a second and use this image to talk about my process. My process is extremely research intensive. I read and shoot and read, and the reading informs the shooting, and the shooting informs the reading. And in the course of doing this project, there are 100 Rosenwald schools listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I read 50 of those National Register nomination forms. And the reason I did that is that I knew how valuable they were, because in 2013, my wife and I bought an old industrial building in Atlanta and ended up restoring it and turning it into a home, and we did this research, and it happens to have this extraordinary unknown, at the time unknown to us, tie to the progressive era in the South. And so I knew how valuable National Register nomination forms were because I've written one. And the story I'm about to tell you comes from the National Register nomination form for the Eleanor Roosevelt School. 1929, Franklin Roosevelt, not yet president, sees Rosenwald School in Meriwether County, and he calls up Edwin Embry, who's running the Rosenwald Fund, and he says, we need more Rosenwald schools in Meriwether County. Well, it's 1929. The recession has set in. The white community is unable to, the white school board is unable to contribute, the black community is unable to contribute, so the idea languishes. 1937, President Roosevelt calls up Edwin Embry and says, I'm ready for my school in Meriwether County. And Edwin Embry says, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago. The program actually formally ends in 1932. So from 1912 to 1932, the program builds 4,977 schools. He says, well, the program formally ended 5 years ago, Mr. President. But for you, Mr. President, and they agree to build what becomes the last Rosenwald School. The Rosenwald Fund contributes, the school system contributes, the black community contributes, the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA is in the Oval Office reporting to President Roosevelt, who asks about the school, and the head of the WPA informs President Roosevelt that they're $1,000 short. And in the Oval Office, President Roosevelt pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap, and later that year he presides over the dedication of this schoolhouse. Now you'll see there, at the time I'm out shooting this work, this building is for sale. When it closed in 1972, it was sold to a family in the cabinet business, and they bricked up the windows and they used it for storage. And it was for sale at the time I was out and about doing this work, and I'm pleased to report that through the work of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, the building has been purchased, conservation easements attached to it, and a brother and sister team are now working to restore this schoolhouse and turn it into a community center and museum. Now, I said earlier that the results of this program were, thank you, the results of this program were transformative. There are 2 economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. Remember, we're coming out of an era where during enslavement, education is essentially prohibited. And then you're coming out of Reconstruction, and you're coming into the beginnings of Jim Crow, and education is largely denied African Americans. So prior to World War I, there's this large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrate Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. And in 1995, I moved back to Atlanta. And for 25 years, I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis's. So I reached out to Congressman Lewis to ask if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said to me, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald schools I just know I went to school there. So I said, Congressman, I will have an essay in this book. There will be 2 essays in this book by prominent African-American preservationists. We will have the history covered. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What was your day like? How did it change you? What role did education play in your life? He said, oh, I can do that. And so it was on October 29th of 2019, I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office. His staff had earlier said to me, can we do this in the Atlanta office? And somewhat boldly, I said, no. Because I wanted this photograph to be in the Washington office because it was a statement of power and a statement of achievement. Congressman Lewis's Washington office was famously called a museum because it was filled with these photographs and mementos of the civil rights movement. And I was sitting with him around this round table in the middle of his space that really served as his desk. Working on the introduction, at the end, he slams his hand down on the table and he says, it's perfect, don't change a word. And his staff, he had been on the floor to vote before that session, and the staff had let me in to set up my lights, and we stood up, and his jacket had been drooped behind the chair, and he stood up and he put the jacket on, and there's this cancer awareness ribbon on his lapel, and he said, should I take the ribbon off? I said, Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you, and that is the authentic you, leave it on. And it was exactly 2 months later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with a pancreatic cancer diagnosis that would take his life the next year. This is the last formal portrait made of Congressman Lewis. Now, this is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, the oldest known surviving Rosenwald school, and one of the few surviving examples of one of the first 2 Rosenwald school designs. I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until February of 2015. I had turned my first book into my publisher. It hadn't even come out yet. I was thinking about what I was going to do next, and I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac. Jeannie had originated the role of African-American Cultural Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office, and she's the first person to tell me about Rosenwald schools, and the story shocked me. I'm a 5th-generation Jewish Georgian. I had been a civic activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I never heard of Rosenwald schools? So I came home and I Googled it, and I found that while there were some books on the topic, including Stephanie Deutsch's book, which is where I started and which is fantastic, there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. It would take 3.5 years. I drove 25,000 miles. In fact, across all 15 of the program states, when I actually had all these numbers in a spreadsheet and I added them up, and I'm like, it couldn't have possibly have been that many. There must be a formula error in the spreadsheet. There was not. It was 25,000 miles. And of the original 4,978 schools, only about 500 survive. Only about half of those have been restored. I shot 105 of the surviving schools, and the result is this project, this book, this exhibition. I'm going to bring you inside the Emory School because I want to talk about the architecture. But to do that, I have to tell you the story of Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor is the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect. He happens to be the great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in public policy circles in Chicago and a principal advisor to President Obama during his entire tenure in the White House. Robert Robinson Taylor is hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to the Tuskegee campus today, itself a National Historic Site, many of the beautiful buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team that lays out the architectural principles of the Rosenwald schools. On the left here, these large banks of 9/9 pane windows that let in lots of light because these schoolhouses would not have originally had electricity. Cloakrooms on the right, so the dirty outer garments could be kept out of the education spaces and the education spaces kept cleaner. These brick chimneys invented the potbelly stove that kept the schoolhouse warm on colder days. And the room divider that's about 2/3 of the way back toward the end of this room, that would have had in it a series of doors that could be closed off to separate the 2 education spaces or accordioned back to create a unified space that could serve as a community center outside of education hours. This is progressive era architecture in service to education. And these basic principles persist throughout the entire history of the program. Now, this is actually what's known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school. The Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina. James Hope was the state school superintendent in South Carolina, who was so committed to the Rosenwald Schools program that every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald schools. And the Hope family all but donated. They basically sold for $5, which is even, in 1926, essentially a donation. Sold for $5 the 2 acres for this schoolhouse. And then Black community in appreciation named the school in honor of James Hope. The school closed in 1954 and fell into disrepair. And several decades later, Ron Hope, the grandnephew of James Hope, career Army officer, retires back to Newberry County, South Carolina. He says, I'm on a pension from the US government, from the people of the United States. What can I do to give back? And he realizes that the schoolhouse has been languishing. He single-handedly, and I mean single-handedly, restored this schoolhouse. If you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. This is a 2-teacher school. This is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, the basic architectural principles of the Rosenwald Schools program was that the architecture was to be modest. That was in part to save cost and in part to avoid attracting the ire, otherwise known as arson, from the local white citizenry. But there was another dictate which comes from Fletcher Dressler, who was an architectural advisor of the Rosenwald Schools program, a professor at George Peabody College in Nashville, which is now part of Vanderbilt. Fletcher Dressler believed that there should not be cupolas. That's cupola. He did not believe in cupolas on schoolhouses because he saw cupolas as derivative of church architecture, and that a cupola on a schoolhouse was a violation of separation of church and state. But this schoolhouse has a cupola. In fact, of the 105 schools that I went to, 3 of them have cupolas. Remember, the African American community has to participate, and they count cash, land, material, or labor. This community wanted a cupola, and they built a cupola. This is African American Community Agency in 1920 Jim Crow, Eastern North Carolina. Now, you've seen 1-teacher schools, 2-teacher schools, 3-teacher schools, these small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1-, 2-, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. And if the architecture of this schoolhouse looks vaguely familiar with its Art Deco architecture, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central was also the architect of Dunbar. And several members of the Little Rock Nine attended Dunbar before they participated in the integration of Little Rock Central, which is about a mile from this schoolhouse. Now, I knew that this was an extraordinary story. It was not clear from the beginning how you tell it visually. And so I started out looking at the exteriors of these images, this architectural narrative of 1-, 2-, and 3-teacher schools in these small white clapboard structures and transitioning to these larger brick structures. But when I found out that only 10% of the original schools had survived, and only half of those had been restored, I realized that the historic preservation imperative and the adaptive reuse imperative was an extraordinarily important part of this story. And in order to tell that story, I had to get inside, and that meant I needed permission. And that's when I meet all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, and I bring their stories into this narrative with portraits. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters. This is in Cass County, Texas, about 2 hours east of here. When this schoolhouse closed, these women decided that it needed to be turned into a community center, and they started quilting to raise the funds to restore the schoolhouse. And it is now, 3 of these women had parents that went to Rosenwald schools. 3 of these women went to Rosenwald schools, and LaJoyce Flanagan in the front row center here was a teacher in this schoolhouse. They sold the quilts that raised the money to allow the restoration of the school, to turn it into the community center that it is today. And these women gather on most Mondays in the schoolhouse to quilt. And I'll simply add that I commissioned them to do a quilt for us, and it's our bedspread at home. This is the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. Notice the pressed, it's now turned into a community center. Notice the pressed tin that covers all the walls and ceilings. An extraordinary statement of the pride this community had in its schoolhouse, and another example of African American community agency, this time 1926, Eastern Tennessee. And this is the Denby School in Warwick County, Virginia. Beatrice Combs attended this schoolhouse, and when it closed, she and her husband purchased the schoolhouse and promptly got into a fight. He wanted to turn it into a bar. She said, "Over my dead body." And it's a two-teacher school, so they has 2 classrooms. They rented it out to 2 families, and Beatrice Combs joined an evangelical church that was meeting in a strip mall. And in the words of her daughter, she accepted the Lord. And eventually they rent the schoolhouse out to the church. The church thrives. They sell the schoolhouse to the church adds on to it. And Beatrice Combs was an usher and was the secretary of this church her entire life. And today, her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are still members of this church. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my process because there's a certain dimensionality, and it's called an aspect ratio to these images, which is 3:2. And that in the linearity of these schoolhouses doesn't quite match that aspect ratio. And so therefore, when I'm shooting these images, sometimes I have to think about foreground or sky. And if I'm shooting sky, clouds are much more interesting. And so what I would often do is I was doing my research. I would spend a lot of time on Google Maps looking at in aerial shots of which way a schoolhouse faced, because if it faced east, I needed to be there in the morning. Otherwise, it would be in shadow, unless it's a cloudy day, which is always helpful. If it faced west, of course, I needed to be there in the afternoon. And so I planned my trips out around this geography and around weather. And in this particular schoolhouse, I was in Washington, D.C. I had a dinner back in Washington that night, so I only had till 3 o'clock. And yet, it was going to be bright sun, and this schoolhouse faces west, so in the morning it's going to be in dark shadow, and it was going to be blue sky, but about 1:30 the clouds were going to come in. So I drive down there, I get down there about 10:30, and I'm just camped out across the street. There's about a 6-lane road between me and the schoolhouse, and it's dark shadow, it's blue sky, it's awful lighting conditions, and about 1:30 the clouds start to come in. And about 5 minutes to 2 o'clock, I'm thinking, 5 more minutes and it'll be perfect. And a van pulls up and parks right in front of the door of the new church. So I drive across the 6 lanes of traffic, I go and I knock on the door. It's the pastor. And I tell him what I'm doing, and he could not have been nicer, and he brings me in and he shows me around, and he takes me into the old schoolhouse where the portrait of Beatrice Combs hangs above the doorway in what is now the Beatrice Combs Fellowship Hall. And he tells me her family story, and he puts me in touch with her daughter, who tells me the stories that I just shared with y'all. And when this exhibition premiered at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren all came down to see the exhibition. Now, this is a portrait of Abraham Lincoln in the walls of the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee, extremely beautifully redone Rosenwald School, and you see the pattern of the 9/9 pane windows that are the signature architecture of Rosenwald schools. But then you see schools like this. This is the Hannah School in Newberry County, South Carolina, across the street from its namesake, the Hannah AME Church. And in where the church's graveyard has grown up around the schoolhouse, and in the kind of detail you can never make up, this schoolhouse rises on Deadfall Road. But you see, this schoolhouse is in great disrepair and at risk of collapse. These places, these spaces, are the locus of history and memory in a community. And when we lose places and spaces like this, we lose a piece of the American soul. And so there is an inherent plea in this body of work for historic preservation, to keep this history and these memories alive. And indeed, there were times that I came across schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently. They were surrounded by yellow caution tape or emergency fencing. This is a W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, North Carolina, that was demolished, unbeknownst to me, 1 week before I got there because the building had become too unstable. But as I mentioned earlier, the heart and soul of this journey is the people that I met along the way. This is inside the K. Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald has hung in this schoolhouse since it opened in 1923. These are brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. They both attended this school. They went to college. They went to graduate school. They both became educators. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles became a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all of whom went through this school, all of whom went to college. These 6 siblings have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened were it not for this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Springs School, Forest County, Mississippi. This is the story of Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer Sr.'s grandfather donated the 2 acres of land for this schoolhouse. Vernon Damer attended this school. When the schoolhouse closed in 1958, the grandfather had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause. So the schoolhouse reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned it into a locus of civil rights activism. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And when Vernon Damer, who was the head of the NAACP in Forest County, Mississippi, working for Medgar Evers, when Vernon Damer drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he would have them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. Their son Dennis told me the story that in 1964, Freedom Summer, the family threw on the grounds of the schoolhouse a picnic for the voter registration volunteers, black and white, and at 11 years old, it was the first time Dennis had seen blacks and whites socialize together. All of this, as you can imagine, drew the ire of the KKK. And Vernon Damer's home, which is just behind the trees on the right side of this schoolhouse, on the night of January 10th, 1966, was firebombed by the KKK. And Vernon Damer stood in the window of the front of his home with a gun trying to hold the attackers off while his wife Ellie got the children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries in that fire. This is inside the Bay Springs School. This is Ellie Damer. Ellie Damer went to a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi, went off to college, came back, taught in this schoolhouse. And when this schoolhouse closed in 1958, because the state of Mississippi had built a brand new, larger, consolidated, segregated school, do the math, 4 years after Brown v. Board, the state of Mississippi is building new, segregated schools. Ellie Damer was denied employment at this school because of her husband's activism, and she had to get a job in a school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for the next 21 years. Their son, Dennis, had recently led the restoration of this schoolhouse to turn it back into a community center, which it serves the area today. This is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. This is just outside of Austin. At the time I was out shooting this work, this schoolhouse was in the last throes of being restored. In November of 2022, the schoolhouse had been successfully turned into a community center and museum, and I keynoted the 100th anniversary celebration of the schoolhouse. This is inside the Hopewell School. Notice the mottled texture on the wall, that's primer. You see the plastic sheeting on the floor, protecting the floor from the paint. The potbelly stove on the right is wrapped. The portrait in the center of this image is Sophia and Martin McDonald. That's from the 19th century. They were both born into slavery. And upon emancipation, they started raising farm animals. They acquired some land. They acquired some more land. They eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donated 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher was their daughter. one of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. They both went off to college. They came back, had an entire career as educators in Bastrop County, and have been leading the restoration of this schoolhouse. And Elroy was telling me the story that, I've shot a lot in abandoned buildings, and one of the things that I've learned is that as long as the roof is intact, you can live to fight another day. If the roof goes, the building will go, very quickly. And Elroy would climb up on the building and nail this tin on top of the roof to try to protect the building, and then the Texas prairie winds would blow it off, and he'd have to go back up there and do it all over again. But it worked, and the schoolhouse has now been restored. I found this type of story time and time again. Former students becoming teachers, becoming the keepers of the flame of history and memory in a community. And it's why I felt compelled to write a short story that goes with each of these photographs, or in some cases, pairs of photographs. Because I found Rosenwald schools directly connected to the Trail of Tears, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the litigation of Brown v. Board, embezzlement, murder, and those stories are told in the prose that helps bring life to a number of these images. Now, this is about Rosenwald schools, but there's another component of Julius Rosenwald's philanthropic legacy which was too important to leave out, and that's the Rosenwald Fellowships. Starting in 1928 and running till 1948, the Rosenwald Fund provided fellowships to intellectuals and creatives. Now, 278 of these went to white liberal Southerners, like playwright Lillian Smith, newspaper editor Ralph McGill, but 587 of them went to the veritable who's who of African-American intellectuals and creatives. It's the largest source of philanthropic support of African-American intellectual and creatives in the 20th century. You know the names: Zora Neale Hurston, Marian Anderson, James Weldon Johnston, Langston Hughes. Gordon Parks is the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald grant. And Gordon Parks was one of my heroes in the space of photography. Gordon Parks famously said that his camera was his choice of weapon. And it was from Gordon Parks that I learned that art could be activism. And I had the great privilege of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on book tour for his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. Well, roll forward to my time in Atlanta, Georgia, and his daughter, Leslie Parks Bailey, is actually a friend of ours. And so I reached out to Leslie and I said, Leslie, I'd like to bring your father's story into this broader narrative. And I've got this idea of doing a portrait with you hugging one of your dad's photographs. And she said, that's a great idea. And she put me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation, who immediately emailed me back a copy of this image. And they said, this self-portrait of Gordon Parks was part of his application to the Rosenwald Fellowship. I said, that'll do. So they sent me the photograph, and I had it framed, and I had always wanted this portrait to be on a manhole cover, because one of Gordon Parks's seminal bodies of photography was a photo documentary that he did in 1952 for Life magazine, which was a photo illustration of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and the man is coming out of the manhole. So that's the origin of this image. But there's another part of this history which is hugely important. It was the Rosenwald Fellowship. Gordon Parks is doing fashion and portrait photography in the South Side of Chicago. The Rosenwald Fellowship places him in Washington, D.C. with Roy Stryker's photo documentary unit inside of the Farm Security Administration. Now, Roy Stryker is this towering figure in the history of American photo documentary. He leads this team inside the Farm Security Administration that is documenting both the pain of the Great Depression and the work of the New Deal programs. And it is a collection of extraordinary photographers. You know some of the images. Dorothea Lange's photograph, Migrant Mother. You know this image. Carl Meidens, who wins a Pulitzer Prize for his war photography in the Vietnam War, was part of this unit. And there's a lot of important photographers that come through this unit. And so Gordon Parks comes and he's working to work for Roy Stryker. And Roy Stryker says to him, go down to this department store in Washington, D.C. and buy an overcoat. Gordon Parks goes down. He's physically thrown out of the store. And he's furious. And he comes back to meet with Roy Stryker. And Stryker says, shoot your anger. He soon sees, late at night, he's in the office, and he sees, you know the image, he sees this cleaning woman in their offices, and he does her portrait in front of the 48-star American flag, mop in one hand, broom in another, American Gothic. He brings this image back to Roy Stryker, and Stryker says, are you trying to get us fired? That famous image is not shown in public for years because it was considered so subversive. But Gordon Parks becomes Gordon Parks in part because of this placement by the Rosenwald Fellowships. So I come to this work as an activist. And there's a component of this story that I've thought about what does it say to me? And the thing that I reflect on is that Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington are building schools for African American children in 1912, deeply segregated, deeply Jim Crow America. That is an extraordinary act of optimism. That is a multi-generational act. And I find great power in this combination of optimism and long ball. And indeed, for everything Congressman Lewis had been through, this was actually the heart of his philosophy. He would say with great frequency, be hopeful, be optimistic. Our work is not the work of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the work of a lifetime. And so I'll close with this refrain from Congressman Lewis. Be optimistic, think long term, and indeed make good trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We could listen forever. Okay, let's get started with questions. Remember, if you have a question, write it on the note card and our volunteers will come by and pick it up. And we already have several. Were there any efforts to create something like the Rosenwald schools during Reconstruction, or was that too early?
So during Reconstruction, there was an entity called the Freedmen's Bureau, which did create a number of schools. And in fact, shockingly, there is a portrait of a teacher who taught in the Ridgely School in Prince George's County, Maryland. Her first teaching job was actually in a surviving Freedmen's Bureau school. But many of those schools, first of all, the Freedmen's Bureau was dismantled at the end of Reconstruction, and many of those schools ended up, when they fell into great disrepair, there's very few of them left.
Okay. Why do you think this partnership program was not more widely known, or were not widely known at all?
Yeah. So there's a couple of answers to that question. First of all, Julius Rosenwald was a modest man, and he did not want things named after them. He did not call these Rosenwald schools. The Rosenwald schools name actually came from the folks at Tuskegee that were distinguishing it from other programs around schools that they were working on. Julius Rosenwald created the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. They wanted to put his name on it. He said, no thank you. And Julius Rosenwald was one of the early philanthropists to say that he wanted all the money to be spent in the fund within X number of years of his death. He believed that the generation that helped create the wealth, the customers of Sears, that generation should benefit from the philanthropic results of that wealth. And so he mandated that all the funds in the Rosenwald Fund should be spent within 25 years of his death. This has become very fashionable in philanthropy today. Bernie Marcus, the co-founder of Home Depot, just died in Atlanta. Everything in the Marcus Foundation must be spent within 15 years. Bill Gates has said this, Warren Buffett has said this. It was unheard of at the time. And so one of the reasons why he's less well known, is that his name does not survive on the name of a foundation like some of his philanthropic peers like Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller. The other is that these schools served multiple generations. The first generation knew that they were working toward the Rosenwald grant, but by the time you get second generation in these schools, third generation in these schools, John Lewis was the third generation of his family to go to a Rosenwald school. By the time you get into that third generation, that connection to Julius Rosenwald's been lost.
Got it. What drove Rosenwald's philanthropy?
So Julius Rosenwald is basically motivated by his Judaism. He sees America as a safe haven from anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America treats her African-American citizens. And I'm not going to get this quote exactly right, but but he says basically, I believe in America. I do not see how America can go forward if part of its people are left behind.
Right. It's in the exhibition.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us more about how these schools were used after school hours as community centers and hubs of the community?
Yeah, I mean, this is important infrastructure for a community, a Black community, and this idea that it can be a community center was very important in integrating in creating sort of the civic glue in a community, and I think that's why today we think about how public buildings are often used as community spaces, but a lot of them are not. And I think that there's an important legacy that comes out of this around being able to use architecture to bring community together.
Right, that multi-purpose. What can you share with us about Rosenwald's and Washington's relationship? How did they meet, and what brought them together?
So they meet, so let's go back in the story. In 1910, Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington meet in 1911. In 1910, the leaders of the YMCA in Chicago come to Julius Rosenwald and ask him to contribute to YMCA, segregated YMCA for the white community. And he says, you see that C? I'm Jewish. I think there's plenty of C's out there that can help contribute to this. But if you decide to build a YMCA for the Black community, you come see me.
Wow.
And late in 1910, they come back and see him, and they ask him to contribute to a new YMCA in Chicago. And he shocks his guests with two statements. Back then, a YMCA cost about $100,000 to build. He says, I will contribute $25,000 if the rest of the community, Black and white, will raise the remaining $75,000. And he says, I will do that in any major city in America. The Wabash Avenue, the Wabash Avenue YMCA in Chicago, which still exists, was built with this. The first one was the one in Washington, D.C., which is now the Thurgood Marshall Center. The Butler Avenue YMCA in Atlanta, Georgia, which has its own storied history in the civil rights movement, all came through this program. 24 of these YMCAs. But that's the beginning of Julius Rosenwald's link between philanthropy and self-help. Right. Booker T. Washington is teaching self-help as part of the core pedagogy at Tuskegee. And Booker T. Washington hears about this program. He comes to Chicago in 1911, May 18th, 1911, with an agenda. He wants Booker T. Washington to come onto the board of Tuskegee. And they meet, and Booker T. Washington later that year comes down by train to Tuskegee. He's impressed with what he sees, and he agrees to go on the board of Tuskegee. But the two men like each other, and they keep talking. What can we do together? And it's in 1912 that they create this program.
Wow. I believe that the current building of the Dallas Black Dance Theater was one of the YMCAs for Black community. Zanetta Drew is in the building. Is this true, Zanetta? That's correct.
Oh,
yeah,
great.
Thank you.
I'll have to add that to my narrative.
Add that to your list, yeah. Andrew, you clearly are so passionate about this work. What drives you to tell these stories?
My work is about bringing people, using photographs, to bring people into stories that they would not otherwise have access to. And when you think about, we believe in this, it's no secret we live in a divided America. And we often find problems in this country intractable, especially those related to race. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington in 1912 America are reaching across divides of race, of religion, of region, and they fundamentally changed this country for the better. And I think this is a reminder to all of us that individual actions do matter, that we are the change.
Yes.
And that it is we who have the capacity to change the world.
Hear, hear. Can you share anything about the demise or when these schools were closing because of desegregation and what that meant to the communities?
So the second part of that question is extremely important. So the Brown v. Board rulings, there's two of them, 1954 and 1955. Some of the school, so if you'll notice in the school, as you'll see in the images of these schoolhouses, I have the name of the school because the schools were named by the local community. Some of them are named after features of the landscape. Some of them are named after the churches that may be next door because the churches might have led the fundraising efforts. Some of them are named after prominent citizens in the community. Some of them are named after African-American figures. There's a number of schools named after Black poet Paul Dunbar. Now I forgot the question. What was it? Give me the question again.
About the impact of desegregation and what that meant for these schools and for the communities.
Yeah. So you have the school name, then you have the county because the funds flowed through the county in the state, but the funds flowed through the county school board. And then you have the date, the opening date, but you have the closing date. And the reason I have the closing date in there is to highlight how the response to Brown v. Board varied not just by state, but by individual school district. Some of these schoolhouses closed in 1954 and 1955. Some of them are open into the 1970s.
Wow.
But I think it's important to recognize that there was, like a lot of things, there's a double-edged sword here. Because when the desegregation order comes, the whites didn't want to send their children to black schools, so the blacks had to go to the white schools. And many of the black teachers lost their jobs. And that was a real hardship on the black community.
Yeah. Let's see, this person noticed that a lot of the schools have a ramp. And was that a common feature? Do you know what the purpose of the ramp was?
That's known as the Americans for Disabilities Act.
So it was added after 1992?
That is added in the restoration of the schoolhouses.
Got it.
That was not an original feature of Rosenwald school architecture.
But very observant. At what point did you realize that you were photographing something that was incredibly special?
You know, I said I started out with these one teacher schools, two teacher schools, three teacher schools, and then the brick buildings. And it was Stephanie Deutsch who introduced me to Ron Hope, who had restored the Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina. And I had previously been out there to photograph the school, and that's when I belatedly figured out that portraits were an important part of the story. So I called up Ron again, and I said, I want to come over and I want to do your portrait. And I show up, and there's Ron Hope wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a Vietnam veteran's ball cap. And I can't believe how lucky I am. And I'm like, he's in the schoolhouse, and I'm going back to pick my lights, and I'm texting my wife, you're not going to believe this. And it was the first portrait that I did of this work. And the way you do, in case y'all don't know, the way you shoot black and white photography digitally is you shoot it in color. And then you have to put it into the software and convert it to black and white. And you shoot it differently because of the outcome you're anticipating, but when I put it into the software and I converted it to black and white and I knew it had worked, that was the moment where I figured out, like, that's how you tell the story. And that was the moment where I knew it would work.
It's very powerful. Rescued the individuals. Yeah. Can you recall what the furthest west Rosenwald school was?
Well, you had schools in Texas, but the vast majority of those schools were in East Texas, and the further west you go, there's parts of Texas, there's a limit to how far west the schools go. There are schools in Oklahoma, and those would be the furthest west, but I don't know where in that, exactly
But
where.
nothing west of
Yeah,
Texas. Okay. Is there any sort of historical trail mapping and documenting of these schools? And that may be what the National Park Service is working
Yes.
on. Yes.
This is the vision of Dorothy Cantor's vision behind the idea of a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park would include Rosenwald schools in each of the states, plus the visitor center in Chicago. And if that's something that y'all find compelling, please catch up with Stephanie Deutsch, board member, or Dorothy Cantor, founder and board member, after this program. Or later, there's a website, which is rosenwaldpark.org.
Terrific. Do you have any connections with the people who manage the Rosenwald School database at Fisk University?
That's a loaded question. So when I was out, because the Rosenwald Schools program was run out of Nashville for a big chunk of its history, the Rosenwald Fund archives were at Fisk University. And when I was out and about shooting this work, there was an online database that you could search by county, and it was incredibly valuable. That database had been created with some grants that only a couple of years before had allowed them to digitize those aspects of their records. Well, Fisk Archive just got some additional funding, or not just, several years ago got some additional funding to digitize all of their records. And for some reason that is inexplicable to many of us, they took the existing database down while they are working on digitizing everything else. Now, why they couldn't do both at the same time, I don't know. And we were joking, Stephanie George and I were joking earlier today around how, well, they said it was going to be back up in the fall, and now they said it'll be back up in the spring, and it's still not back up, and it's kind of frustrating. But if anybody's doing research, the archivists at Fisk University are incredibly helpful, and you can call them directly, and they'll always get you the information that you need.
Right. And hopefully it will be available soon.
And hopefully it'll be available soon, yes. Because I actually still use this data. I mean, it comes up with great frequency questions around schools where this database would be incredibly helpful.
Okay, this question is from an HBCU grad. Considering there are many unequitable schools and underfunded inner city schools that exist today, how do you feel that equitable education can be obtained again?
Well, I come to this not as a public policy person, but more with a historical background, and so here's what I'll say. Education has been the backbone of the American dream, the on-ramp to the American middle class, since before there was the United States of America. The first taxpayer-funded school in America was created in 1644 in Dedham, Massachusetts. That's more than 370 years ago. And there's a direct connection between that moment, that commitment to public education, the Land Grant College Act, 1862, which creates colleges all across America, including many here in Texas. Historically black colleges and universities, predominantly, not all, but predominantly created in the decades after the Civil War. Rosenwald schools in the early decades of the 20th century. The educational provisions of the GI Bill transform America from relatively poor to relatively prosperous. Brown versus Board of Education is one of the high water marks of the civil rights movement. And what are we talking about today? College affordability in crisis, crushing levels of student debt. This is a 370-plus year narrative arc in which education has been the on-ramp to the American middle class, the backbone of the American dream, and it is a tradition at risk. And we need to do everything we can to maintain that tradition because, as Congressman Lewis writes in the introduction to my book, education is the cornerstone of democracy.
Amen. Amen from a public school teacher. There's a large anti-DEI sentiment today. What can we do to counteract that?
I think I'm not planning on changing any of my behavior. That individuals matter, individual dignity matters, every human life matters. And we have to do everything that we all can do to make sure that everybody is welcomed into the polity of America, everybody has economic opportunity in America, everybody has access to education in America, and I don't think I'm not planning on changing my behavior because of the political winds.
Awesome. Hear, hear. All right, final question. You said when we lose these places, we lose pieces of the American soul. How can we individually advocate for the preservation of Rosenwald schools and ensure the legacy of these schools is well known for future generations?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, you can support the campaign to create the Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. But the other piece of this is this, that there are preservation efforts in many communities to preserve these schools. And if there are efforts in a particular, if you want to get connected to a particular effort, you can Google it because there's things, these are often found online. But the Texas Historical Commission knows about the Rosenwald schools that are restored and unrestored. They've done a census in this state. The local preservation organizations will often have the Rosenwald schools on their radar screen or know the groups in the community that are coming together to support the restoration of these schoolhouses. And there is also an entity called the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which was under the umbrella of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They raise money to preserve African American heritage sites. They do 2 funding rounds a year. Every funding round includes at least one Rosenwald school. And supporting the Action Fund is another way to get involved.
And locally, I encourage you to get engaged with Preservation Dallas. We don't have a Rosenwald school in Dallas, but there are plenty of historic structures that need preserving. So get engaged with that organization too. Andrew, thank you so much for your talk.
Let me just reiterate what an incredible exhibition this is. It's an honor to be part of it. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the exhibition. Enjoy the book. Please tell your friends to come see it. And I look forward to the dialogue that this will stimulate in the community.
Andrew will be signing books in the lobby. We have a few books left for purchase, but we also have book plates. So if you don't get one of the books that we have left and would like to have him sign a book plate, he's happy to. I would ask that you let Andrew exit and get before we empty the theater so he can be ready to sign. And don't forget that we are open until 9. So if you haven't yet gone through the exhibition, please go through. But come back and visit us and tell your friends to come see this exhibition. It's open through August 17th. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.